We can't really achieve direct democracy in precisely the sense that the Athenians did. But it's important to start by understanding that the Athenians themselves didn't have direct democracy in the way that we tend to think of that. And it was on the basis of the premise that this was a small community that could gather all in one place and make the decisions about what should happen, that the founders rejected that example as a possibility. So I think there are elements of Athenian practice which did try to ensure that the full democracy, the full group of citizens in all its diversity was actually represented in decision making, and in fact in every context where power is exercised. That attempt by them, call it whatever we want, I just call it genuine self-government by a diverse society, that we can actually realize elements of that. I think one important threat to democracy is our belief that we've achieved it. And quite often people will acknowledge that we don't really have a democracy. We have a constitutional republic, the rule of law rather than of men. But the difficulty is that that system and its premises don't really give us full representation by the mix of people who make up a democracy. So I think that itself is a threat. It's the belief that somehow we've addressed the problem of equality and full representation, and that we have genuine self-government when we don't. I think another threat to democracy related to that is entrenched and growing inequality. That causes us, I think, either to withdraw from politics, from the idea that politics has any real leverage on what's most important about what's happening in our society, or it means that we assume that we have the capacity to deal with that, when in fact we don't. And going forward, I think that's going to really pose a problem for us as a society, that we cannot figure out how to make people who are really different from each other and unequal equal members of our political community. So some people have suggested that we are no longer in need of citizenship, that we're beyond it, for one of two reasons. Either because actually with the internet as a tool, we can now achieve direct realization of our collective wishes as groups or as a community as a whole by using the web facilitated possibilities of expressing ourselves and communicating with each other. And so maybe we're beyond citizenship in the sense that we no longer need a political framework for articulating the differences in our interests and perspectives and figuring out how to move forward together. We can just get it done by using the internet to translate our own desires and concerns into some collective path. Or maybe we're beyond citizenship, so the argument goes, because that idea has now been superseded by social and economic forces that are shaping what we do. The economists sum these up pretty neatly by saying that our frameworks for political engagement have been eroded by developments from above, globalization, which orients each of us and all of us to the world market and makes that the framework within which we identify and pursue our interests. Or secondly, erosion from below, the proliferation of nonprofits and the ability of the web to facilitate identification group interests and then pursuit of them, cutting through existing political frameworks. And lastly, erosion from within, that politicians, perhaps partly because their own power has been attenuated, are increasingly appealing to us as consumers, not as citizens, as bundles of given interests that they want to persuade us they can best achieve, and not as a group of people who have conflicting interests and who need to be thinking about the relation of those to the whole. The premise of democracy is that in a diverse polity comprised of people who vary by personal qualities and talents and skills, education, resources, position in life, and so on, that somehow we can give everybody some kind of an equal say. And that's what I think of as the democratic dilemma, which Plato described typically aptly by saying that democracy distributes a kind of equality to equal and unequal alike. So that's what, Plato regarded that as truly absurd. How can you possibly do that? But that is our dilemma if we're committed to democracy. I think one task before us is to build citizenship, which is not something our system really tries to do. Our system is built on the premise that you can resolve the democratic dilemma of participation of an inclusive and diverse society and legitimate self-government by just calling everybody equal. Just saying, well, you're all citizens, you belong to this society, this polity, so you're all equal. And your equality is expressed by your ability to vote, period. And we don't actually equip anybody to vote well, even to become sufficiently informed and reflective about the relationship between one's own interests and the larger challenges or the larger concerns, to vote well. And we certainly don't build the capacity for stronger forms of citizenship, for engagement, for participation, not only in voting for an elected official, but for helping to make decisions. Oh. So I think disruption is required to move us to something more like democracy, precisely because of the character of the democratic dilemma. If you think about what it takes to distribute a kind of equality to equals and unequals alike, that means that you have to have a very powerful form of political equality. That is equality that is established simply by the political system itself, that requires and enables citizens to act as equal partners. And so that requires disrupting what comes naturally to us, which is to acknowledge people who have greater power or status or education or whatever, and they are the ones who are seen as being in some sense entitled to power. So how do you break that very standard translation? And how do you genuinely engage every citizen in having an equal say, in participating, having access to the extent that they want, but genuinely participating? So to do that, I really think you have to disrupt these altogether natural ways of operating as a political system, and that requires a very strong political structure. I think that the democratic dilemma requires of us a certain unease, a willingness to detach from our immediate and personal preferences based on how we happen to be situated in a society, the kinds of resources and attributes and attachments that we happen to have. And at the same time, to be able to express those concerns, because democracy does require respect for an expression of all those diverse interests and perspectives in some way. So I think if we're really going to live democratically, we need to feel uneasy pretty much all the time about how our personal concerns relate to this bigger picture, the bigger set of challenges. And I think the humanities, properly understood, can help us do that, especially, maybe only, if we take what we learn from the humanities and apply them in practice, not as a once and for all recipe for changing things, but as a critical tool, a continual critical tool. You know, who are we? What do we want? Where we is us individually and us big picture. And I think this kind of unease requires a really powerful democratic political structure, so that there is this continual disruption. Again, it's not a once and for all thing. We need to be, when we make decisions and carry them out and hold ourselves accountable, we need to be continually reflecting on how our concerns relate to the bigger picture. So that's democratic uneasiness or dis-ease.